There is a moment, and most of us never see it coming, when the person sitting across from you at the dinner table, the one who knows your middle name and the way you take your coffee, the one you trust with your children and your bank account and your future, turns out to be the most dangerous person in your life. This is not a story about a stranger in a dark alley. This is not a story about a random act of violence in a neighborhood most of us will never visit. This is a story about a man named Mike Patterson, 31 years old, husband, father, real estate appraiser, and by every account the kind of man who showed up early, stayed late, and never once imagined that the two people closest to him in the entire world were sitting across from each other in secret, planning to make sure he never came home. On the morning of December 16th, in the year 2000, Mike Patterson left his house in Tallahassee, Florida before the sun came up. He was going duck hunting at Lake Seminole, a remote reservoir sitting on the border between Florida and Georgia. He told his wife he would be back by noon. They had plans. That evening, it was their 6th wedding anniversary. He never made it home. His truck was found at the boat landing. His boat was found drifting in a cove. His shotgun was still in its case. The gas tank was full. And Mike Patterson was gone. For 44 days, search teams dragged the bottom of that lake. Cadaver dogs swept the shoreline. Dive teams moved in slow grids through water so dark you could not see your hand in front of your face. They found nothing. And in the weeks that followed, investigators quietly suggested that perhaps the lake had done what Florida lakes sometimes do, that alligators had taken the body and left nothing behind. His wife accepted that explanation. His best friend accepted that explanation. The insurance companies eventually accepted that explanation too, because 6 months after Mike Patterson disappeared without a trace, his wife was declared a widow and collected $1.75 million from 3 separate life insurance policies. And life, for everyone except Mike Patterson and his mother, went on. But here is what nobody knew, what almost nobody would know for 17 more years: Mike Patterson had not drowned. He had not been taken by alligators. He had been murdered. Shot on that lake before sunrise, his body hidden in a dry creek bed less than 5 miles from his own front door, where it would remain for nearly 2 decades while his killers attended church, raised his daughter, and looked his mother in the eyes. And the only person in the entire state of Florida who never stopped fighting for the truth, the only person who kept insisting, year after year, that something was wrong, was a woman with no badge, no subpoena power, and no forensic lab. Just a pen, a stack of envelopes, and 17 years of grief that refused to become acceptance. This is her son's story. And it is long overdue. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened to Mike Patterson, you have to understand who Mike Patterson was, because the kind of man he was is exactly the reason the people around him believed they could get away with it. Mike grew up in Bradfordville, a quiet community just north of Tallahassee, in a modest home with parents who did not have a great deal of money but had an enormous amount of determination. His father drove a Greyhound bus. His mother ran a daycare out of their double-wide trailer. They did not take vacations. They did not splurge on luxuries. Instead, they saved, carefully, deliberately, so that both their boys could attend North Florida Christian High School, a private school that neither Mike nor his older brother Nick could have reached on their own. And Mike understood what that sacrifice meant. He worked nights at a supermarket to help cover the cost. He did not complain about it. That was simply who he was, a young man who understood that good things required work, and who was willing to put in that work without being asked. It was at North Florida Christian where Mike met Diane Merrill. She was smart, put together, and came from a family with strong religious convictions, a family that placed enormous value on appearances and on the image of a proper, stable, God-fearing life. They dated through high school. They stayed together after graduation. And in 1994, when they were both in their mid-20s, they got married. By the time Mike was 31 years old, he had built the kind of life that, from the outside, looked exactly like what a man was supposed to want. He had a wife he had loved since he was a teenager. He had a baby daughter he absolutely adored. He had a home in a safe neighborhood and a career as a real estate appraiser that he had built through sheer persistence. A colleague who worked alongside him for nearly 15 years would later say that Mike had the strongest work ethic of anyone she had ever met in her life. He was, by all accounts, a good man. A reliable man. The kind of man you counted on. And that quality, that fundamental, deep-seated trust in the people around him, would be the thing that got him killed. What Mike did not know, what he had no reason to suspect, was that his wife and his best friend had been carrying on a secret affair since at least 1997. 3 years before he disappeared. Ryan Caldwell had known Mike since high school. He had become one of Mike's closest friends, the kind of friendship where you know each other's families, where you share holidays, where your children grow up together. Ryan had become an insurance agent, and Mike trusted him completely in that capacity. Ryan was the one who recommended that Mike take out a significant life insurance policy. He helped him structure it. He managed the paperwork. By late 2000, Mike Patterson had 3 separate life insurance policies totaling $1.75 million, all of them written by his best friend, all of them naming his wife as the sole beneficiary. And one of those policies was nearing its lapse date, which meant that if Mike died after that date, the money would not pay out. Time, for Diane and Ryan, was running short. According to Ryan's confession, the one he would deliver to investigators 17 years later, the plan to kill Mike had been discussed for years. Multiple approaches were considered and rejected. Diane had suggested at one point staging a boating accident on the Gulf of Mexico, one that would claim both Mike and Ryan's then wife simultaneously, so the two of them could simply begin their life together without complications. Ryan refused. He did not want to kill the mother of his children. Other ideas came and went: a staged robbery at Mike's office, an arranged accident on a rural road. Eventually, they settled on what seemed like the most natural option available to them: a duck hunting trip at a remote lake, where accidents happened, where there were no witnesses, where alligators could theoretically be blamed for the absence of a body. Ryan would invite himself along. He would make it look routine, 2 old friends spending a December morning on the water together. And then he would make sure Mike Patterson never came home. What Ryan Caldwell apparently did not account for was the possibility that Mike Patterson would fight back. That is the thing about a plan built on the assumption that your victim will cooperate: it tends to fall apart the moment the victim decides not to. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we get to what happened on that lake, you need to understand the third figure in this story. The one who was not in the boat. The one who was not at the lake. The one who would spend the next 17 years doing the work that law enforcement could not, or would not, do. You need to understand Eleanor Patterson, Mike's mother. Because without Eleanor, this story does not have an ending. Eleanor Patterson was not the kind of woman who made headlines. She was not a lawyer or a detective or a politician. She ran a daycare. She lived modestly. She raised her boys with the same quiet, steady devotion that she would later bring to the single most relentless pursuit of her life. From the very first day Mike was reported missing, something felt wrong to Eleanor. She could not point to a specific piece of evidence. She could not name a specific fact that contradicted the official explanation. It was something deeper than that, a mother's knowledge, the kind that cannot be argued with and cannot be dismissed, even though law enforcement tried to dismiss it for 17 straight years. She began keeping notes almost immediately. Details she observed. Inconsistencies she noticed. Things that did not add up when she held them next to each other. Over time, those notes grew into 27 pages of documented concerns. She brought them to law enforcement. They thanked her for her time. They showed her to the door. She did not stop. In 2009, Eleanor Patterson began writing to the governor of Florida, 1 letter per day. Every single day, she sat down and wrote another letter, demanding that the state appoint a special prosecutor to investigate her son's disappearance. Most of those letters were forwarded, unopened, back to the same agency that had already closed the case. By the time the truth finally came out, Eleanor had sent more than 2,600 letters. She had been writing them for nearly a decade. She had not missed a single day. There is something about that image, a mother at her kitchen table, day after day, year after year, writing a letter that almost no one would ever read, that says everything you need to know about what kind of woman Eleanor Patterson is. She did not have resources. She did not have power. She had conviction. And in the end, conviction was enough. Let us go back to that morning. December 16, 2000. A Saturday. Mike Patterson woke before sunrise and moved quietly through his house so he would not disturb his wife or his baby daughter. He was planning a short hunting trip, just a morning on the water at Lake Seminole, the reservoir about 50 miles west-northwest of Tallahassee where he had hunted many times before. He had a real estate licensing exam scheduled for later that day. He and Diane were supposed to celebrate their anniversary that evening. It was, by every measure, supposed to be an ordinary Saturday in the life of an ordinary man. He told Diane he would be home by noon. He climbed into his truck, hooked up his boat trailer, and drove west into the darkness. What happened next, what Ryan Caldwell would eventually describe in a recorded confession played for a Florida jury, is the kind of thing that is almost impossible to process, even with 17 years of distance between the act and the revelation. Ryan was already at the lake when Mike arrived. He had been there before sunrise. He met his best friend at the boat landing, as though this were any other hunting morning between two men who had known each other since they were teenagers. They launched the boat together. They moved out across the dark water toward a secluded cove. And then, out on that still, cold Florida reservoir in the gray December dawn, Ryan Caldwell convinced his best friend to put on his waders. Mike complied. He trusted Ryan. Why wouldn't he? Ryan was his oldest friend. Ryan wrote his insurance policies. Ryan had helped him save money for his retirement. Mike Patterson put on those heavy rubber waders, the ones designed to keep a duck hunter dry when standing in shallow water, and Ryan pushed him overboard. The water of Lake Seminole in December is cold and dark and deep. The waders filled immediately. Mike should have gone under. But Mike Patterson was 31 years old and he was not ready to die. He fought his way to the surface. He pulled himself toward a tree stump that broke the water nearby and he held on. He was still alive. Ryan Caldwell, according to his own account, panicked. None of it was going the way he had planned. He reached for the shotgun. And he fired. Mike Patterson, who had left home that morning planning to take a licensing exam and celebrate his wedding anniversary, died on a lake he loved, shot by the men he had trusted most in the world. Ryan then transported the body, not to the police, not to a hospital, not to any of the people who would spend the next 44 days searching that lake, but to a dry creek bed on property owned by his family, a few miles from the homes where they all lived. He buried Mike there. Then he drove back to the boat landing, walked into the circle of family and friends gathering at the shore, and began to help look for his victim. What followed was not a clumsy, panicked cover-up. It was a calculated, methodical deception that would hold together for nearly 2 decades. Approximately 6 months after Mike disappeared, investigators searching the lake recovered a pair of waders, a hunting jacket, and a flashlight with a hunting license inside the pocket bearing Mike's name and signature. These items were presented to the court as evidence that Mike had drowned. But investigators who later examined those items noticed something deeply troubling: there were no bite marks on the waders. No damage consistent with months submerged in water. No decomposition. The items appeared, in the assessment of later investigators, to have been placed in that lake sometime after Mike's death, placed there deliberately to give Diane the evidence she needed to have Mike declared legally dead ahead of schedule. In the state of Florida, a missing person cannot be declared legally dead without a body for 5 years. Diane Patterson did not want to wait 5 years. She wanted the insurance money. And so, the items appeared. Her attorney argued successfully before a judge that the recovered waders, jacket, and hunting license constituted sufficient proof of accidental drowning. The judge agreed. 6 months after Mike Patterson vanished, in what investigators would later describe as an abnormally fast ruling, he was declared legally dead. Cause of death: accidental drowning while duck hunting on Lake Seminole. Body not recovered. Within months, Diane collected $1.75 million. She was calm. She was composed. She was already planning her next chapter. Investigators who interviewed her in the early stages of the case would later describe her effect as matter-of-fact and cold, no visible grief, no softening, nothing that looked like a widow processing the loss of the men she had married as a teenager. One detective who sat across from her during an early interview simply said, "There was nothing there." Ryan Caldwell, for his part, told detectives he had been 60 miles away from the lake on the morning Mike disappeared. He said he had been planning to go hunting with his father-in-law but had overslept. It was a lie. Investigators could not prove it at the time. But they noted it. They filed it away. And they moved on, because without a body, without a crime scene, without any physical evidence of foul play, there was simply no case to make. The lake had swallowed the evidence, or so everyone was supposed to believe. And for a while, that belief held. For a long while. In 2005, 5 years after Mike Patterson was reported missing and 5 years after his best friend buried him in a creek bed, Diane Merrill Williams married Ryan Caldwell. In Tallahassee. In the same community where Mike had grown up. People talked. Of course, people talked. A widow marrying the dead man's best friend, the same men who had written his life insurance policies, the same men who had helped at the search parties, the same men who had stood beside Diane at the memorial. It raised eyebrows. Neighbors whispered. Colleagues exchanged glances. And Eleanor Patterson, who had been raising her concerns with law enforcement for years, escalated. But without evidence, without a body, without a shred of forensic proof, there was nothing anyone could do. The case had been officially closed. The death certificate had been signed. The insurance money had been paid. Life moved on. For a while, at least, the life Diane and Ryan had built on the bones of Mike Patterson held together. They had a home. They had routines. They had the appearance, that all-important appearance, of a normal family. But appearances, as this story demonstrates better than almost any other, are fragile things. By 2010, Ryan Caldwell's behavior had begun to deteriorate. He developed a drug habit. He began having affairs. The paranoia that apparently had shadowed both of them since the murder began to fracture the relationship from the inside. They separated in 2012. By 2015, Diane had filed for divorce. Ryan contested it. He was ordered by a court to comply. He did not handle that well. On the morning of August 5, 2016, Diane walked out of her home in Tallahassee and climbed into her car to drive to work. She had a professional job at the Florida Department of Financial Services. She was, in fact, working as a financial crimes prosecutor, investigating fraud on behalf of the state of Florida. The irony of that detail is almost beyond description. As she sat in the driver's seat, she became aware of a presence in the back seat. Ryan Caldwell had hidden in her car. He had a gun. He ordered her to drive. He held her at gunpoint for a period of time before she managed to get away and contact police. Ryan was arrested. He was charged with kidnapping and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. He was facing 20 years in prison. And suddenly, for the first time in 16 years, he had something to gain from telling the truth, and absolutely everything to lose by staying quiet. The state of Florida made Ryan Caldwell an offer. Prosecutors needed him. Without his cooperation, Mike Patterson's case would almost certainly remain an unsolved disappearance forever. There was no crime scene. There was no murder weapon. There was no physical evidence linking anyone to anything. The only path to justice for Mike Patterson ran directly through the men who had killed him. And so, prosecutors made the deal, full immunity from any charges related to Mike's murder, in exchange for a complete and truthful confession and cooperation in the prosecution of Diane. Ryan Caldwell took the deal. He sat down with investigators from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and he told them everything. He described the affair. He described the planning. He described the multiple schemes that had been proposed and rejected. He described driving to Lake Seminole before sunrise on December 16, 2000. He described going out on the water with his best friend. He described the waiters. He described what happened when Mike fought back. He described the shotgun. He described burying the body. And then he told them exactly where to find it. In October 2017, 17 years and 10 months after Mike Patterson left home for a duck hunting trip he never returned from, investigators found his remains in a dry creek bed on property belonging to the Caldwell family, a few miles from downtown Tallahassee. The condition and location of the remains were consistent with everything Ryan had described in his confession. DNA testing confirmed the identification. Mike Patterson had been there the entire time. While his mother wrote letters. While law enforcement filed them away unopened. While Diane collected the insurance money and attended church and built a new life on the ruins of the old one. Mike Patterson was in the ground. Waiting. The day after investigators announced the recovery of Mike's remains, Ryan Caldwell was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the kidnapping of his ex-wife. No mention was made of the murder at his sentencing. He had his immunity. He would not be charged. The news of Mike's recovery hit Tallahassee like a wave. People who had wondered for 17 years, who had whispered and speculated and eventually moved on with their lives, suddenly found themselves confronting a truth that was darker than anything the rumors had suggested. Mike had not drowned. He had not been taken by alligators. He had been shot by his best friend on a cold December morning and buried in secret while the people who loved him searched a lake that held no answers. Eleanor Patterson, who had spent 17 years writing letters that almost no one read, who had been told in 100 different ways to accept what the investigators had concluded, who had kept going when every rational person around her had given up, Eleanor Patterson had been right all along. Diane Patterson was arrested in May 2018. The charges were first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and accessory after the fact in the murder of her husband, Jerry Michael Patterson. She was brought before a judge and denied bail. Her attorneys argued she was not a flight risk. The judge disagreed. She sat in the Leon County Jail awaiting trial. The irony that she had spent years prosecuting financial crimes for the state of Florida was noted by nearly every outlet that covered the arrest. The woman who had collected $1.75 million by orchestrating her husband's murder had been, until the moment of her arrest, a prosecutor. She had sat across tables from people accused of deceiving the financial systems of Florida, and she had built cases against them. She knew how investigations worked. She knew how evidence was assembled. She knew how prosecutorial decisions were made. And for 17 years, that knowledge had helped her believe, probably correctly, that she was safe. The trial began in December 2018. Ryan Caldwell was the prosecution's star witness. He took the stand and described, in careful and systematic detail, every step of the plan he and Diane had executed together. He described the affair that had started years before Mike's death. He described Diane's refusal to divorce Mike because her family viewed divorce as shameful and she could not tolerate the damage it would do to her image. He described the conversations in which they agreed that the only way they could be together was if Mike was dead. His taped confession, the one he had given FDLE investigators in the months following his kidnapping arrest, was played for the jury. In it, Ryan described the relationship with Diane as something that had simply snowballed, started as a rekindled high school romance, grown into an obsession, and eventually calcified into murder. "We were Bonnie and Clyde," Ryan told investigators on that tape. "We were partners in crime." There was also testimony from Kathy Thomas, Ryan's first wife, who told the jury that she had long suspected Ryan and Diane were involved, that the behavior she had observed in the late 1990s was not the behavior of two people who were merely family friends. Prosecutors also presented recordings made by Kathy Thomas of conversations with Diane in 2018, conversations in which Diane made statements that prosecutors argued were consistent with consciousness of guilt. Diane's defense team challenged the admissibility of Ryan's taped confession, arguing that a man who had confessed to murder and been granted immunity should not be the cornerstone of a prosecution. The judge disagreed. The tape was admitted. The jury heard Ryan Caldwell describe, in his own words and his own voice, what had happened on Lake Seminole on December 16, 2000. They heard him say that the plan had been Diane's idea. That she had pushed for it. That she had been the one unwilling to consider any alternative that did not end with Mike Patterson dead. After several days of testimony, the jury deliberated. They came back with a verdict. Diane Patterson was found guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. She will be in her 80s before she is eligible for release. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes with a case like this one, a frustration that justice, even when it arrives, does not always arrive in the shape we need it to take. Ryan Caldwell, by every factual account, is the man who pushed Mike Patterson into the water and fired the shot that ended his life. He is the one who drove the body to the creek bed. He is the one who buried it. He is the one who planted the evidence in the lake. He is the one who looked Mike's family in the eyes at search parties and at memorials and at all the quiet, ordinary gatherings of a tight-knit Florida community, and said nothing for 17 years. And Ryan Caldwell will not spend a single day in prison for any of that. His immunity deal was the price the state paid to get Diane. Some prosecutors called it a necessary compromise. Others, and there were many, called it a failure. Nancy Grace, who covered the case on national television, put it plainly: sometimes justice doesn't feel like justice. Mike Patterson's daughter, who was an infant when her father was murdered, who grew up calling Ryan Caldwell Dad, who spent the first 17 years of her life inside the household of the two people who conspired to destroy her father, was a teenager when the truth came out. Her name was Ensley. And she has had to carry something that no amount of courtroom verdicts can lift, the knowledge that she was raised by her father's killers. That the memories she has of childhood are contaminated by the people who made them with her. That every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary afternoon of her young life happened in the shadow of a crime she did not know about. Whatever justice looks like for Ensley Patterson, it is not a 30-year sentence. It is not an immunity deal. It is something that the legal system has no mechanism for addressing. And that is perhaps the deepest wound this story leaves behind. Eleanor Patterson stood in that courtroom when the verdict was read. She had been fighting for this moment for 17 years. She had written more than 2,600 letters. She had been dismissed, ignored, and quietly pitted by people who assumed she was a grieving mother who could not accept the truth. But Eleanor Patterson had known the truth all along. She simply had to wait for the world to catch up with her. When a reporter asked her what she felt after the verdict, she said, "Justice is what I wanted for Mike. That's what I've been fighting for 17 years." There was no triumph in her voice. There was no celebration. There was only the quiet, exhausted relief of a woman who had carried something unbearable for a very long time, and could finally, after 17 years of letters and heartbreak and refusal to quit, set it down. Mike Patterson was 31 years old. He had a daughter he would never see grow up. He had a work ethic that inspired everyone around him. He had a mother who loved him with a ferocity that outlasted every obstacle placed in its path. He trusted his wife with his life. He trusted his best friend with his future. And both of them, for reasons that therapy and courtrooms and documentary series can analyze but never fully explain, decided that his life was worth less than what they wanted for themselves. He was buried in a creek bed for 17 years. He deserved better. He deserved the truth. And in the end, even if the form it took was imperfect and incomplete, he got it. I want to ask you something before we wrap this up. Eleanor Patterson wrote a letter every single day for years. She was told to stop. She was told to accept it. She was told the case was closed. And she kept writing. If you were in her position, if every single official door had been closed in your face, if the people with authority had told you the matter was settled, if the years kept passing and the world kept moving on, would you have kept going? Would you have had that kind of love, that kind of refusal, that kind of conviction? I genuinely want to know what you think. Leave your answer in the comments below. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, share it. Because Mike Patterson's story should be heard. His mother made sure it would be. The least we can do is make sure it reaches as far as possible. We will see you in our next one.